So welcome, Sanjay. Really excited to chat with you and discuss different aspects of your book, The Truth About Us. Over the next hour or so, we'll cover a bunch of themes ranging from your motivation in writing this book and also go deep into different things you brought out very nicely and sort of integrated those. So just to get us started, Sanjay, do you want tell a little bit about yourself, your background, and also what brought you to writing the book, The Truth About Us, The Politics of Information from Manu to Modi?
You started with the hardest question, of course, which is discovering motivation. I used to be an engineer at one point. I've studied cities and I've written on cities, on urbanization, on inequality, on land. And all along, you keep absorbing information and ideas and theories. So this had been kind of baking somewhere in the back of my head for a while. And so when I got through all the projects, it's time to take it on. And I think what I have is a reasonable and interesting sort of explanation for really a bunch of what we are taught is our history and the way politics and history kind of intertwine today to, which is the lifeblood of the country right now. It's the boiling point of the country. So I wish I could give you an eureka moment, but I don't have one. It's an accumulation. It happened over time.
Mm-hmm. Just curious, how much time did it take you to write this book? What was your research process? How do you go about all of this?
Oh, I think the writing was from the day I wrote the first words to the last, a year and a half or a little less than that. But the percolation process is longer. So the way I work, when I'm ready to write, I write pretty fast. But getting ready to write takes me a while. I've got to see the whole thing before I begin. And just getting to that vision point of seeing all the pieces and how they flow, that probably took, I don't know, 5-6 years before that. While I was working on other stuff, this is building in my head, this goes here, that goes there. This is the thread. This is how I organize it. Yeah.
I think the book you finally managed to write is a very, very important one. So let me ask you, from your vantage point, why do you think it's important for millions of Indians, perhaps people outside of India, to think about and know more about the truth about us, right? Who we are as a people, where we come from, where we might go. Why is it important for people to know the truth about us?
Well, without proper self-knowledge, I don't think we can be wise in our actions, right? And it is because we do not have good self-knowledge, or the knowledge about ourselves that's been constructed by the powers that be. That's part of the argument of the book. Is convenient to them, certainly, but it doesn't necessarily work to our convenience. And it becomes this moment of polarization that we are in India right now, this moment of almost hatred, if you will. And the marketing and branding of polarization of hate and hatred is possible because of our poor self-knowledge, of our ignorance about how our history has been written, how our identities have been created. Which is not to say that any book is going to change any of this. I mean, part of the embedded argument in the book is that it's very, very difficult to change people's minds, right? So you do this. Ultimately, I've come to the point, having been around for a while now, come to the point that you work for your own satisfaction. You write so that you can understand things better, not that you can make others understand better. I find the act of writing to be very disciplining. And it forces you to think much more clearly. You have to argue with your best self to put, the the best ideas you can on paper. So really, it's really a very selfish exercise at one level, because um, surely I'm not going to convince people who have an entirely different belief set inside their heads of what I'm saying. But maybe some people who are aligned, the Rasiks and the Rasikas who are aligned to the way I like to think, maybe they'll have a few more arrows in their quiver. Maybe they'll have a better understanding of themselves. I mean, small hopes, little hopes.
Yeah, no, no, absolutely. I think beyond the argument of writing a book because one wants to write that book, and the selfish reason you ascribe, I think I was thinking about your book, that even the title about the book, right, the truth about us. I think the truth about us might help reduce the lies about us that people carry in their heads, right? So obviously the narrative that people carry in their heads has a
If
lot.
they read it, though, Neeraj, if they read it, and reading a whole book is a luxury that um, is something that most Indians don't do anymore. I mean, they live in their social media worlds. They look at pictures, they look at images, and at most they read 200, 300 words, maybe an op-ed of 1,000 words. A full book is hard. It's
Yeah.
अभ्यास का भी व्यापार है, रियाज का भी व्यापार है. I mean, you got to practice reading. I mean, habits of the mind also need practice and exercise. So yeah, I see it as, from a pragmatic perspective, futile. It. I'm sorry, I'm sounding so negative, but I'm more and more convinced that the people who need convincing, people who need to be told the truth about themselves, don't want to hear it. They don't have the time to hear it. So we talk amongst ourselves, they talk amongst themselves.
Yeah, no, you're right. I think India generally has the lowest per capita, one of the lowest per capita book reading habits. Also, there are these chambers that you're describing, right? So let's now jump to a couple of conceptual questions, right? A couple of frameworks that you use in your book before we jump to the content of your book. The first thing you describe is the decision, information, knowledge, wisdom kind of pathway, and how it gets used slightly differently or substantially differently by both experts and non-experts to make sense of the world around them, right?
Yep.
Can you tell me a little bit more about how, let's say, experts use this to make sense of India? Let's say how historians or people like you use this to make sense of India, to discover our truths, and how, let's say, the common layperson uses this, the non-expert uses this to make sense of India.
Well, the expert view is, how do you get from information to knowledge to wisdom? It begins from the building blocks of information. You want to find out something about something. First, you gather verifiable empirical information about it. And then you collect different blocks of information, and together you begin to see connections between them. And that begins to become the building blocks of knowledge. And once you've accumulated enough knowledge about different elements of society, of history, of economy, of behavior, and so on, you get to a point of wisdom, hopefully, that you see a bigger picture. It's like a kind of a godlike view, right? Seeing from the top, seeing everything, like like a satellite. I can see all of India, its hills, valleys, rivers, greens, browns, and so on. But most people don't see the world that way, right? They see it from around where they are. They see only the ground around them, the world around them, and their worldview, so to speak, is shaped on what inputs they have, their information blocks. And their information blocks aren't data. They're stories, they're narratives, they're stereotypes. They're things that they learned from their parents. They're things that they learn from their neighbors. They pick up more stories to add to the stories they already know, but the new stories they pick up kind of attach to the existing stories inside their head, right? All of us do this. So most of us have a hard time, picking up something completely new. Siberian folk tales. Yeah, sure, they exist, but how do I get into that world? I have no exposure to it. So people with non-expert people, laypersons, kind of build story upon story, and they build these meta stories inside their heads, these stereotypes that guide behavior and decision making. And wisdom, I don't know whether wisdom is possible through that approach. It is possible that many among the laypersons begin to see the contradictions between stories. If they're keeping their eyes and ears open, they begin to see, well, no, I believe this, but I'm seeing this. Kuch gadbad ho sakta hai. And doubt may be wisdom in that perspective. Um, and most of us are not expert in most things, right? So in most things, we also behave like lay persons. But a few things we try to be expert in, right? We try to know it well and make it rational, information-based, and so on. But lay persons don't. So the best among them end up in doubt. The worst end up in certainty. There's a Yeats poem. It's a very well-known poem. Uh, Things fall apart. I don't know whether you've read it. And one of the lines in there is the best are full of uncertainty, and the worst are full of certitude. So that really applies. I mean, one could use that as kind of a real metaphor for some of the arguments I'm making in this book.
Yeah, and no, absolutely. This thing about certainty and how the human mind really craves certainty is really important.
Yep.
I don't know if you read this book, by I and Thou by Martin Buber. He also talks about false prophets, right? And how false prophets, they peddle simple truths that people then like, and then they sort of start following them. I love the way you sort of almost you drew correspondence between wisdom and doubt in the mind of lay people, and spotting contradictions being the trigger, spotting contradictory stories being the trigger for that. Can you share maybe a personal example of how maybe for yourself or somebody there was something contradictory that you noticed about, let's say, the story of India that gets told, and how that led to doubt? Is there something that you can share as a personal example?
I can go the other way quite easily. I mean, so with the pandemic, I was in a conversation with a family member, and he said, the Muslims are refusing to have the vaccination, and I sort of pointed out, well, only 2% of India has been vaccinated. For you to actually pick up data that's really not officially reported anywhere, and to find a story is quite amazing. I mean, it is, you have no evidence. All the evidence is to the contrary, but you're not interested. There's a story inside your head, and regardless of the data, you are kind of adding to that story, building on that story. Now, another person might look at this and say, at a similar situation, and say, well, the Jamaat Taglibi versus the Kumbh Mela, and they would say, well, similar situations, kind of blind religious beliefs, and sort of irrational behavior, and we kind of classified one group one way and classified another group another way. There's a contradiction in here, and there are people who notice that. And these are kind of just current examples, but you can see it happening all the time. Some people are open to doubt, and some people are not. They will actually figure out untruths and lies that will add to their repertoire of what they know as the truth. They'll add those stories. Oh, when the vaccination started, the Muslims were refusing. They're not us. They are not among us. They're separate. Let's separate them.
Yeah, no, those are great examples. So moving to a slightly different conceptual frame that you've used in your book, you describe this thing called the politics of information, and then you say that it has this politics of information has three variables. One, it has to do with the power of the people who sort of organize information. Second, the level of technology available, and third is this concept of simple information, right? And how all of these three things together really do shape narrative. Can you talk a little? I found this to be a very powerful frame. So, can you talk a little bit about this whole concept of politics of information and also these three different variables, and also how this has played out in the story of India, the way it sort of gets seen right now?
Yeah, I mean that's a big question, right? But let me see if I can do justice in speaking about it. It begins from the idea that in the social realm, pretty much all information is political. Um, I mean, there are certain objective realities. Maybe Gujaratis on average are this tall, or Punjabis on average are this tall. Those are objective, but nobody cares about those. They care about Gujaratis being people with certain characteristics, Punjabis being and the categories of Gujarati, Punjabi, and so on. And my understanding, and this is what drove me to write the book, is how is information organized? How is information politicized? Um, how does information become information? What is relevant information? What do we count? What do we look at? Um, and and this is pretty well known. I mean, people have been writing about this for a very long time. I mean, from ancient times to modern times. I mean, in modern times, Foucault is probably the best example. And I like the work of Ian Hacking a lot, also, he's a philosopher. Um, and they all say, information is what power decides it is, right? And the power to actually say, I'm going to look at this and not that. This is a relevant variable, that is not. And the ability to categorize that information. We take human characteristics and variables and say, well, this group looks to me like tribal in India. What the heck is tribal? What the heck is caste or subcaste or supercaste or mega caste? Who gets to decide these categories? What is SC? What is ST? What belongs? What does not? Power is the ability to decide what is information, to categorize it, to rank it, and to give the categories certain abilities. If you belong in such and such a group, you can vote in such and such a place. If you belong in such and such a group, I shall give you a certain level of reservation in jobs or universities. And that makes these categories real, right? Attaching significant outcomes to them. So power is a very, very important variable. And the more the power of the categorizer, the more easily he or she gets to do the categorization, gets to do the counting, gets to choose what I'm going to look at and what I'm not. And for the longest time, we were defined by asymmetries of power, right? Super asymmetries of power. And the really interesting element of the current age is that many of those asymmetries have broken down, but they have raised kind of interesting challenges. So they've broken down because of technology, right? So the second big variable is the information technology available. Before we could write and record stuff and write things down, how did information get around? It's word to mouth, through stories that were repeated, songs that were repeated, mostly through songs, actually. Poetry and songs remain inside one's head. Words don't. But over time, you discover writing. So some stuff begins to be recorded. Most of it disappears, of course, the technology, the stuff on which we wrote, they didn't last. Some edicts, rock edicts, carvings on stones and survive, but other stuff doesn't. The printing press is a huge leap. It allows dissemination in large form, in great form, in great quantity. And it really shifts it more than anything else. It moves out, I think, into what we have come to think of as kind of this enlightened, kind of rational, scientific age. With the printing press, new people who did not have power before begin to enter the picture, because eventually, if you can afford it, you can get your own press. You can print your own stuff and let people see it. And you just stretch that argument to the present moment and the internet and social media. Anybody can create information. There was a time when only the king could create information, or only the priest could create information, to now where anybody can create information. So information technology, of course, plays a huge role in what people know or how people know things. And then the big thing in my argument, which I believe is the original argument that lets it all kind of work together, is this idea of simple information, which is not my idea. Other people have written about it. I'm particularly indebted to Daniel Kahneman and Tversky and their work, and a bunch of behavioral psychologists and economists. And my own kind of thinking of over the years of why people believe what they believe. Why do they hear not what is being said, but what they want to hear, right? And I have come to believe that the three aspects to this, people prefer simple information to complex information. Complexity is very hard to deal with. The brain freezes up. And complexity in everything, every issue that you encounter can be stultifying. It can just stop in your tracks, and you're unable to take action anymore. Simplification is key to human biology, to identify friend and foe and food and poison and so on. And the more complexity there is, the more you have to simplify. The more information there is, the greater is the need for simplification. I mean, Google's the best example. There are, 2 billion websites in the world right now, roughly. If you want to search for something, there's like maybe 2 million websites that have information for you. You can't trawl through 2 million of them. So Google will actually use its algorithm to present for you a ranked list. Here's your first choice, here's your second choice. They have simplified that information for you, right? And the more the sources of information, the more choices you have as to what you're going to hear, what you're going to consume, what you're going to believe. So the simplification process works for everyone. We do it all the time. It's never away from us. We do it unconsciously most of the time. We create stereotypes about people of a different faith, of a different skin pigmentation, of a different gender, of sexual orientation. We deal with difference with stereotypes, and these stereotypes are simplifications. Each one of us is simplifying the world all the time. In the biological world, it has great utility. In the social world, can be genuinely dangerous. So these three things together really eventually yield both the expert view of history, how the state uses its power to create narratives about us, and individuals' views of society, who we are, and how we belong with people around us. It's this process of simplification is what I believe, what I've argued.
Yeah, thanks, Sanjay. I found your logic very impeccable, especially around this simple information, and also slightly scary, right? The conclusions one, even though in the end we'll cover that, you draw a slightly more hopeful conclusion for India. Actually, if one were to extend your logic, it actually leads us to a fairly scary situation where if reality, if delusion is measured as the gap between reality and perceived reality, and the complexities inherent in a society prevent people from understanding the reality, and they use simple information, then the delusion rank of a complex society should keep on increasing, right? We'll come to that, but I think there is something in I'd like to ask you about why you are hopeful towards the end of this interview, but this was super powerful as an approach. Now, coming to the heart, actually, the way you described the history for India, right? You say that essentially we've had three versions of this idea of India. The first one was the British Brahmin version. The second one was the Nehru Gandhi version, and the third one, perhaps 2.5th one, is this whole RSS Hindutva idea of India, right? We'll go into details of this, especially the British Brahmin one, but can you give the big picture overview of each of these three different frames and imaginings of India?
I think the first one is really important. I write that the colonizers wrote the first draft of the history of India, right? And they did that on the basis of some convenient texts that mostly written by Brahmins, almost entirely written by Brahmins. I mean, you need to look at the compulsion. Do we want to step into the British Brahmin version now, or do you want to overview?
Well, maybe we do the overview first, just because it'll be easier to sort of read for folks, and then we can deep dive into the British Brahmin.
Okay. So the colonizers basically wrote the first draft of Indian history, and by which I mean really identifying us as a people, who we are, right? So they created the super majority category called Hindus, and there are very, very good reasons to think that the super majority category never existed. It was brought into existence through power, through state power, by declaring that it exists. I mean, that's, Ian Hacking's very powerful idea, sort of labeling theory. Once you declare that an object exists, you will find that that category gets populated. And so thus became Hinduism. Thus became most of the caste and religion structure of India. Now, the second version, which I've called the kind of Nehru Gandhi version, the nationalist version, wanted to assert not only a social and cultural identity of a map created by colonization, right? It was the British who created the map of India. That map had never existed before. No king had ever ruled anything like this before. There were no practices that were common across this whole geography. And so the nationalists needed to create an idea of India themselves. And interestingly enough, they went to the same sources, which is ancient stuff, right? The Shastras, the Sanskrit texts to say we are a long civilization, we are an unbroken civilization, we're a deep civilization with philosophy, with great ideas about science, art, and so on, all of which is true. They're wonderful ideas about art, science, deeply original thinking, really, really good stuff. Except that it really was the text of a very small minority of Indians. We don't have the texts of the other Indians, and because they don't have texts, they don't have history. I mean, that's one of the really important ideas, that without text, you don't have a history. You are prehistoric. So the people who got a history, who got a voice, who got a say, who got an identity, were the people who created texts. And what the nationalist version did was it glorified that history and those texts, and what the they take a lot of the assumptions for granted in the first draft about Hinduism, about social structure. What the third version of what I'm calling the 2.5th version, because I'm actually pretty sure, I'm not hopeful, I'm pretty sure it will never become version 3.0. And we can talk about it later. I differ with the vast majority of people who've kind of criticized me for saying that. Is actually a particularly selective reading of those same texts again. And we are kind of, our destiny seems to have been written from these texts which very few people have actually read. Very few people know Sanskrit. Very few people read. Most people rely on interpreters of those texts to tell us what's in them. I haven't read most of it. What I've read is in English anyway, so I'm at the mercy of the person who interpreted that text. And this particular version takes an ideologically different view of enmity, of hatred, of division, and a particularly selective reading of basically those same texts. So we are kind of relying on a bunch of texts over and over again to interpret ourselves and our identities. The only thing that differs is who's doing the interpretation, right? When the British were doing the interpretation, it was in their interest. When the nationalists were doing the interpretation, it was in their interests. When the Hindutva brigade is doing the interpretation, it's in their interests. That aligns with their ideology, with their goals, what they hope to achieve, and to have power and continue in power. It's about power. It's about using history, text, identity, etc., to first take power and then hold on to it and expand it.
Thanks for that, Sanjay. It really helped clarify a lot of stuff for me. So thanks for that. Let's now sort of go deep into in the first version of this, right? The British Brahmin version. And I found the chapters there super nicely written, where you almost put yourself in the shoes of the colonial administrator, the kind of stuff they'd be grappling with, why they wanted to figure stuff about India, who these people were, and then they went about commissioning some research. They chose some texts, they chose some interpreters, and texts like Manusmriti were chosen, etc. And then through that, they almost induced a certain idea of India, right? So they imagined certain. Can you tell what exactly happened in some detail? Because this is really rich, and I think it's really important for folks to know this.
Well, I mean, once the colonizers became these almost accidental imperialists, I don't think anybody had a grand vision of, oh, we shall begin trade in Calcutta, and we will soon kind of rule this entire subcontinent. I don't think there was any blueprint over there. So these accidental imperialists now found a pretty large territory with, I'm guessing roughly, well more than 100 million, maybe as much as 150 million people, who seem to be extremely different from each other. Right? They didn't seem to have a common law. They didn't seem to have common practices. They didn't pray to the same entities. They spoke different languages. Their ritual structures were different. Everything was different. And law particularly mattered. Right? How do you settle disputes? What is a crime? What is not a crime? If a crime happens, how do you punish people? What is a severe crime? What is not? How do you settle property disputes? Property disputes, as long as the idea of property exists, property disputes exist. How do you settle this? Now, one of the things these accidental imperialists did not want to do is import their law, right? because they thought it would be too much of an imposition and the people would rise up in rebellion. And they needed to find the people's law, the people's rules, what governed. And it started with an idea of finding a common law. Here's this vast land, very diverse, very different from each other. Not only are the regions different from each other, but within regions, there are vast differences. And the search for law led to the monastery. It had never been law anywhere in India. They found the version they said was the canonical version, was actually roughly one of 50 versions of what is roughly known as the Manusmriti. This is called the Kuluka Bhatta version, I think. And they said, yeah, we found it, the key, that unlocks this whole society. These are the rules. It over time, of course, we know that these are not the rules. We know that there was not only not the rules then, they're not the rules anywhere ever. That there are many, many different versions of it. The vast majority of Indians then and now have no idea what's in the Manusmriti. People simply do not know. They just assume. If you start reading that book, at least in English version, once again, I don't read Sanskrit, I've read the English translations. It's actually quite shocking what they say, that these are the rules. The Mandal Commission report, for instance, is just a very smart report, actually. Early on, kind of discusses, what's in the Manusmriti, and one of the things that's written in there is, every time a Shudra takes the name of a Brahmin, you shall put a red hot spike through that person's tongue. Now, I don't know about you, to me, that is fantasy, right? To the writers of the Mandal Commission, they said, yeah, obviously this did not happen. If this did not happen, how do you know what happened? How do we know what of Manu's laws were laws and what were fantasies? To me, most of Manu strikes as fantasy is, if I had all the power in the world, this is how I would behave with people. It's a pretty evil fantasy, most of it. And yet, through the accident of timing, discovery, and translation, this became the defining text of India, the one that led to Mill writing the history of India, the one that led to really 50 years of interpreting India from roughly 1800 to 1850, by which time more philosophical texts are beginning to be discovered and translated. And there's so much doubt and uncertainty in Indian philosophy. There's so much questioning of self and knowledge in Indian philosophy, in the deeper texts, and these begin to become available. But by the time it's too late, the minds have been set. There's a particular view and vision of India that's already been created, that has a particular view of caste, the Chaturvarna caste society. And the censuses are beginning to be developed, and by the soon after the Sepoy rebellion, censuses are beginning to be conducted. There were earlier censuses and then more serious censuses. Censuses need categories, and categories are now imposed from above because there's a theoretical vision of India. This is what India is like. And they begin with the vision of the Chaturvarna caste society. And pretty soon they find this is impossible. There is no Chaturvarna caste society in India. In fact, it is actually impossible to discern what is the caste society of India. In fact, we can't even tell what caste is. Right? At this point, we can say, we cannot even define what caste is. We cannot even define what tribe is. Yet we have these systems, right? They have been defined for us. We have a caste structure of society. We have tribal structure of society. And these are done during these early years of the census. Um, I mean, I could go on, and I mean, this is like, I've written about 3 or 4 chapters on this. This is just the exercise of power, creating categories, counting, and making huge decisions. You know, the tribals are Hindus. Well, one of the rules in the census was, if a person cannot tell you what his or her religion is, and which most people could not, because they had not a conception of religion, which is an European concept. Most people could not tell you, you are Hindu. That is, if you do not call yourself Muslim, you are Hindu. That is how we've been defined. And that is, interestingly, how we continue to behave today. Is Hinduism is defined by being not Muslim.
Yeah.
I mean, as I said, I could go on, but I don't want to just get crazy about this one area.
This is absolutely like fascinating and also absurd in the extreme. And we'll come to the census, and I do want to talk about the census in detail with you. But can you just tell me, in your mind, what were some of the absurd outcomes that happened, let's say, between the early 1800s, let's say, when Manusmriti started getting used as the text to understand India, to, let's say, the formal census that happened towards 1880, etc. So in that process, in that duration, how did this understanding of India, what were some of the absolute absurd things that happened in how people got categorized, right? Which then also shaped the way, let's say, the census instrument itself was designed, right? So you've already mentioned the examples of, let's say, tribals. You've mentioned Hinduism being a catch-all, right? If not Muslim, then Hindu. What were some of the other absurd sort of things that happened? And also, is it correct to say that the lines between different types of people became very rigid? There was a lot of fluid stuff happening. People were sort of taking on different identities, but that hardened in these 60, 70 years between the early 1800s and the formal census, just because of the interpretation.
I'm actually a bit fuzzy in my head about, say 1830 to 1860, right? You know, there's so much churn happening in society. How that churn is being interpreted by the people in the churn, that's Indians, and people looking from above, which is the colonizers. I'm frankly fuzzy. I haven't paid a lot of attention to that. My sense is the hardening really did not happen as much till the censuses were undertaken. But I'm not sure of it, because I do see that the first half of the 19th century is also very much a time of Brahmin ascendance, right? And before then, Brahmins were not powerful people. I mean, the most of their power came from being the interpreters of our past, of creating a categorical system and kind of convincing the British this is Indian social categorization, and that placed them on top. So my sense is, and there's some writing on this, that this is the period. David Washbrook, for instance, has written on this. This is the period when Brahmins became really ascendant. And the sense of, you know, Brahmins at the top of that there's a caste system, and at the top are the Brahmins. This began to become a well-established idea, certain in British heads. And I think through a lot of on-the-ground practice in different parts of India, with the encouragement and abetment of the British, that allowed Brahmins to get to the head of the line. Because remember, before the 19th century, in most places, Brahmins were pretty darn poor, right? I mean, a lot of them did not own land. A lot of them were not allowed to own land. They were dependent on the business castes, the landowning groups, people who gave them alms, but they, you know, without money, it's very hard to have power. Yes, ritual power, Sure, if you think that's what matters, but I don't know how many people think that ritual power is the most important power. So this category that really was not powerful or important or moneyed now suddenly began to become important and moneyed and powerful. Now, this is not a process I have actually tracked in the book. So I will hopefully not be held to a hard account on what I'm saying over here. I at some point, if I gather the energy, I have to go back to this period. My interest really is, how the census kind of begins to create these more hardened boundaries, those as to the ritual everyday behavior of say, achut behavior, the creating a real category of untouchable, of real category of people whose shadow shall not touch you. That takes various forms in different parts of India. And most of it happened, I think, in the first half of the 19th century, beginning maybe a little bit earlier from the decline of the Mughals and the British rising. Some was happening over there. People like Cynthia Talbot have argued that. But really, it's the first half of the 19th century when everyday ritual practices, I think, began to take this really pungent, really discriminatory view.
Mhm. So let's jump to the census, right? Because that's really your book talks a lot about not only the census as a process, but also the census as an experience and as a consequence, right? So can you tell me a little? Can you share how did the census get structured? The first sort of set of formal censuses, the pan-country census that happened towards the end of the 19th century, and how was it structured? What were the categories within that census? How did people? I remember reading in your book that a lot of people were baffled about the reasons why they were being asked certain questions, right?
Yeah.
So can you tell a little about that, and then we'll come to the implications of that and how that led, how that almost triggered a bunch of things, the morally minto reforms, the political power allocations after that. But first, on the census itself.
Yeah. So I mean, the census is, if all you do is count, there's no problem, right? We have so many heads. But when, in addition to the counts, you now begin to assign attributes, right? This person is such and such religion, such and such other social characteristic. And one of the things that the British were convinced was India was a caste society. And caste was the defining feature of Indian society. I mean, there's the fascinating lines from, say, Monier Williams, who was a big British intellectual defining a lot of top level British thought, that said, these Indians, even if they're educated by us, they really can't give us a clear view of their society. We have to tell it to them. We have to give it to them. So one of the views that they possessed from having read that ancient text was the caste structure of Indian society, including hereditary criminal castes and so on. And they wanted initially to fit everything into the Chaturvarna system. This was in the censuses that were happening roughly 1865 to 72 or so. And you begin to read the accounts from the census commissioners and people who were actually on the ground, they were like, what are we doing? This can't be done. The people don't actually fit the system we are trying to impose on them. And the people were beyond baffled. I mean, first they're asked their religion. They have no idea what it is. They don't know what religion means. They've never heard the term Hinduism. They have actually never heard the word Hinduism. They know Islam. They know, and it goes by many names in India, but they don't know who they are according to the same categorical system. They don't know what their jati is, if jati is caste. Some people tell you their jati is geographical, they're from such and such a place. Some people tell you it's a profession. Some people give you matrilineal examples. It's a complete kitchery. And yet you can get only one attribute. And your attribute cannot say mixed or undetermined, which is what reality is. It's mixed and undetermined, except everybody gets an attribute. And that is what creates really the modern society that we know today. The social identity system of modern India really began from assigning fixed attributes to a very heterogeneous, shifting population that initially had no idea of what even those attributes meant. I mean, it's really hard to put yourself in that mind space, right? I mean, one of the questions I ask in the book is, let's say you've taken a census of religions in India in the year 1800. What would the data show? Would it be like 78% Hindu, 14% Muslim, and such that we have right now? Absolutely not. Sikhism, Jainism, well, they became religions according to the British. Sikhism, for instance, initially was not a religion in the initial censuses, and later on became a religion. This is power grants you recognition. You now exist. You are a category. And once you are a category, well, you get populated, and that population has powers associated or rights associated with it. The One of the things that I'm personally, I won't say puzzled about, I'm saddened by, is the fact that in my entire schooling system, I had a very good education. You had a very good education. I don't think I remember I had no clue, no idea where this came from, where this categorical system came from. And I think it is absolutely imperative for us to have a view of our history and society, that we know this. If nothing else, we know this. I don't know about you, Neeraj, but
Oh no, absolutely. I frankly had no clue as well, which is why these questions have become personally very important for me. So yeah.
do you want me to say more, or do you want to move
No,
on?
I definitely do. So I want you to you describe a chain of events that the census triggered, right? So the and the way the census was structured, this almost invention of categories, right, of caste and religion that happened, how that led to the reforms, how that led to, let's say, allocation of political power based on caste and religion in the early 20th century, and finally leading to sort of independence and partition in a certain way. Can you just talk about that chain of events and the triggering of it being the structure of the census?
Yeah, this is. I don't want to leap too far into this because this is very contentious ground, and the way I read it is um, the most important decision in the census was the creation of Hinduism as this mega aggregator category that included all the diverse religious practices of India, and I don't have to tell you how diverse they are. If you pay any attention to anything from in the Sundarbans in southern Bengal to Kuch Bihar in Bengal. This is just staying inside Bengal. From in the cities of Gujarat to the Dang, or in Andhra, Telangana, everywhere you go, just every region within it has such diversity. So the creation of this super majority category created one very large block. The people who absolutely should not have belonged in this block are what we have come to call tribals. I have yet to see a proper definition of what tribal means. And certainly what we call tribals today have, as far as I can tell, in the years in 1900 had zero link to Hinduism. No Hindu texts, no Hindu gods, no Brahmin priests, nothing whatsoever. But there are not Muslims, or they didn't see themselves as Muslims, therefore they were Hindus. So you put this huge blocks, the groups that we call Dalit now, that were called scheduled caste, and that had other names before, outcasts. Um, how people outside if your system is a caste system, and some people who say are outside your system, how they now get added to your system, I don't know. Power does it, and they did it. But the super majority category became the defining feature of India for the next till today. It is a history that is being written even now. It is a category that started being watched pretty soon, because by this time there's an Indian printing press, right? People are now beginning to pay attention. They don't like the foreign power. They are beginning to circulate ideas against being occupied by a foreign power. There are also other groups are beginning to circulate ideas about, um, we don't like Muslims, and our group needs to get bigger, it needs to get stronger, it needs to get more powerful. And this business of counting, of making your group larger, and that really is, if there is a defining feature of modern Indian society and history, it is this process of creating groups and trying to make them large. Whatever the group is, somehow or the other, make it a larger group, grab power through that enlargement. Um, and you begin to see the nationalist vision begin to emerge, which is, let's get rid of the British. You begin to see the proto-Hindutva view begin to emerge, which is, we need to solidify. If Muslims continue to propagate at the rate that they are, and this story is not new, by the way. This has existed for 150 years. They will outbreed us, and eventually we will disappear. And we need to have more power. That discourse also begins. The proto-Hindutva discourse also begins. The proto-Dalit and subaltern discourse also begins, not in the 19th century, but later in the 20th century. You can call it a divide and rule strategy. Many people have said it's a divide and rule strategy. It certainly creates more and more kind of meta categories, right? There's a big group of Hindus, big group of Muslims, big group of Dalits, and these meta categories now begin to have voice. They begin to write, they begin to articulate, they begin to communicate with in-group members. The modern Indian communication system begins to thrive, really. The newspaper becomes the key instrument by which Indians are now discovering themselves, their identities, their histories, and so on. Now, this is really complicated, because the overarching narrative that we have read in school, I certainly read in school, I presume you did also, I presume it's turning a little different now. The overarching narrative is of the rise of the nationalist movement, right? Is everything else is quieter compared to what eventually became the victors, the people who wrote the history books that we ended up reading. It appears as if everything else was secondary. I'm not sure everything else was secondary. There were really powerful forces at work. The proto-Hindutva forces were really powerful also. The partition of India happened because of this inability to actually find a common vision for the subcontinent. The absurdity of a country called Pakistan, where the East and West, there were 1,500 miles between them. Such a country has never existed in the history of the world. Such a country can never again exist in the history of in the future of the world. There were 1,500 miles separating two, and they were a single country because they shared a religion. These absurdities came about primarily on the basis of self-identity of religion. And these forces were there. You cannot wish them away. You wish them away at your own peril. the ability to actually mobilize this hyper majority of Hinduism category has always existed. It has always been there. To deny it has been foolishness.
Thanks, Sanjay. Moving now to actually, you also write the second half of your book, or the last 30-40% of your book, moves away from almost the historical sort of truths to how different groups in India and how different people in India experience inequality, right? So there's substantial inequality on different parameters, on income, on health, etc. And hence, you say that actually it's really important to understand how different, where different people are, where different groups are, so that we can actually address their problems. And yet you say that there's actually a lot of intentional ignorance because no group has any incentive to know the truth, because in the absence of truth, they can actually make whatever claims they want. They can make whatever political claims they want. You also sort of talk about some data from the 2011 census not being fully released. Can you talk a little bit about how this is playing out in India?
Well, first, let me say that chapter I debated a lot before including it in this book, because it is a bit of a departure. But I felt that if people read this book seriously, they need to know this part, right? And I know it's a stumbling block, that chapter, because it's got data and it's got numbers, and most people switch off when that happens. And I could have put it somewhere else. I thought of putting it on a website. If you're interested, go there. But I kept it in there because I thought it was necessary to underline the fact that we talk about these differences amongst us, right? We had the backward castes. Now we have the other backward classes. We have the tribals, and we have these different religions. And you inherit these categories. Of course, there's no way of escaping these categories. No way of denying them, not officially at least. And yet we don't actually know how these categories materially differ. Right? So how much money does an average Brahmin make compared to an average Dalit in India? Nobody in India knows. Now that strikes me as fundamentally absurd. I mean, we really claim to care a lot about inequality between groups. Yet the material facts of inequality between groups are absolutely and utterly unknown. In fact, we don't even know what group compositions are at this point, right? So we do crown SCs and STs, right? The official categories. But the rest is kind of an amorphous mass. There's some counting of OBCs going on now, but the general cause Brahmins. How many Brahmins exist in India? Nobody knows the answer to that question. How many Brahmins are there in Tamil Nadu? How many Brahmins in UP? Nobody knows the answers. If you don't know how many people there are in a group, how can you tell how much they earn, how much property they have, how much they make, how much education they're getting? And I find this as genuinely puzzling. I mean, this is satirical, actually. It really, I've written at some point, one needs somebody with real talent, that I don't possess, of turning this into kind of a Gulliver's Travels kind of nightmarish scenario where you talk about inequality, while all along you say you don't really want to know what actual inequality is. You have no clue what it is. I have come to the conclusion it serves everybody's purpose. Anybody can spin any narrative they want out of this ignorance. If nobody knows what the truth is, anybody can lay a claim on the truth, and which is what I see happening. Every political party has its own claim on the truth of the social and economic reality of India. You cannot dispute it because you can't prove them. Otherwise, you can't disprove the hypothesis, you can't disprove the claim. So all this fight over reservations goes on. How many people have actually gained from job reservations? How many Dalits have actually gained from job reservations? I've done a little back of the envelope calculation in the book, which you've probably read. and come to the conclusion at most 5% of Dalits have gained from job reservation, and that's a really, really exaggerated number. 5%. Itni ladai for 5%. All this vitriol and division and categorization for 5%, and that too we cannot prove. I don't think Dalit leadership has an interest in telling the Dalit population, well, the very best we can do for you is 5%. At the same time, the non-Dalit leadership, other people from other castes or other groups, or other religions, can say, we are fighting for you. We are getting you these goodies. We're getting other people goodies too. And you are doing better. Just don't ask me how much better, compared to whom. Just trust me when I tell you you're doing better. I'm looking out for your interests. There are no objective criteria, no empirical reality by which you can prove that certain groups are doing better than certain other groups, or which way the trajectories are going. Whereas if you actually dig deep with the really awful data that we have, you can see absolutely alarming trends and realities in India. The data are terrible, but it is still possible to piece together some kind of a patchwork story. And that patchwork story is of increasing inequality between groups, increasing inequality within groups. And really, I don't think anybody has any interest in knowing this truth. Nobody, no political leader of any group, subgroup, or stripe has an interest in saying, well, what we've done for these last 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 years hasn't worked. The entire structure, the system of laws and rights and positive discrimination that we've created hasn't really worked. We need to rebuild this from the ground up. Perhaps think of class, but class is verboten in India. It's not a word we think about anymore. It's one of the prime examples of this. So the last census that counted caste in India was in 1931 in British India. In 2011, after much back and forth, another census was conducted 80 years later that asked for caste for the first time in 80 years. We've never seen the results of that census. We've seen the population counts and so on, but the caste census has never been released. My personal conclusion is it's a bomb. Whatever is in that data will explode, and it will explode in ways that people simply cannot anticipate, they cannot control. And it is in everybody's interest, including people who are below and people who are above, to stay in this space of ignorance, because knowledge over here can be a genuinely frightening thing. I have no idea what's in it. If you know what, Neeraj, I keep repeating myself. I find it beyond absurd that the very social categorical system that defines our entire society is based on assumptions made right now 90 years ago. We have no idea what the reality is right now. I mean, really, have some novelists make this up. I'd love to see somebody actually make up this story. It's hard to imagine.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I found all of this super fascinating, the way you sort of put this down. Anything else you'd like to share? Otherwise, I do want to move to what next, right? The question of anything else you want to share about this, or should we move to the next sort of thing?
No, let's move on. I mean, people will have given up a long time ago hearing this. I mean, who wants to hear the same voice droning on and on?
Okay, so now sort of trying to sort of think about the narrative that will exist, let's say 5 years from now, 10 years from now, the version of India that will exist, right? So you write in your book that you're hopeful that the Hindu Rashtra sort of imposition of the Hindu Rashtra version of India will not succeed on our collective consciousness. And you say that there are lots and lots of people who are creating now narratives. You have a lot of, let's say, Dalit historians. You also have a proliferation of information through social media, etc. But using your framework itself, power, technology, and simple information and biases, cognitive biases. So on the one hand, you have a bunch of people in power who, and there's no sign of that power sort of weakening, and they're trying to impose this version. On the other hand, you do have lots and lots of different people writing their own versions, and you have social media, and yet this thing about confirmation bias, the preference for simple information is not going to go away, right? So what makes you hopeful that this imposition of this Hindu Rashtra version of India will not succeed?
This is a very big question, right? I mean, by all accounts, I'm wrong. So I'm going to dig a little deeper into theory over here. The first thing is, what the Hindutva version is, the attempt right now is to subjugate media, to control information, to put out the same simple story and over again, to actually intimidate dissidents, to subjugate independence. We see it happening everywhere, in traditional media, in print media, in television certainly, and also the social media, internet. You know it very well. We all know this, and there is a sense that this is a juggernaut. This is an irresistible force. There is real power in simplifying a distilled message. People understand it, and people vibe with it. They can go with it, and if it affirms their own beliefs and identities, it really gets traction. There is a real possibility that, particularly in this age of excess of information, because we have so much information now, that the power of simple information is even stronger than before. The need for simplification is more powerful, stronger now than it has ever been, and which gives rise to the possibility of leaders like Modi in India, Trump in the US, people who will just tell you a very simple, self-affirming story in which you feel good at the end of the story, right? All of this is absolutely true. And yet, I, first of all, assume that hubris makes powerful people stumble. Eventually, all power dissipates. I mean, nothing lasts forever. Even the British Empire, over which the sun never set, completely dissipated. So this can't be forever, that's for sure. And nobody's saying it's forever either. They're just thinking 10 years, like you said, the next 5, 10 years. So if it's not forever, what's the 10-year horizon? So on the one hand, there are missteps and hubris. The COVID mismanagement, for instance, is pretty bad. And anecdotally, I'm hearing from people, bhakts, who are expressing some doubt. But people forget. Memories are short term. They may not remember the next time the election rolls around. I'll tell you the deeper reason why I'm hopeful. The deeper reason is India is a genuinely pluralistic society. It's not fakery. People are different. They wear different clothes, they eat different foods, they pray to different gods in different languages. And that difference is expressed in election after election by, say, just in the last few weeks, we had Kerala, Tamil Nadu, and Bengal basically saying, you know what, we got our own thing going over here, right? You can try to impose Jai Sri Ram on us, but in Bengal, maybe Jai Ma Kali would have been better. You know, Ram is, you know, Bengalis tend to view, I'm generalizing over here, as Ram as a not particularly heroic hero. You know, he shoots people in the back, like Sugriva and so on. And they are much more interested in kind of tantric gods and, you know, goddesses more than anything else. And so you try to do what we've always failed to do, the Hindi Hindu Hindustan, right? That vision has been there all along. And every time you try to do that, there's going to be pushback. After all is done, after now several years of messaging on a single theme, the BJP cannot cross 40% of the vote in any election. And my sense is there is a diehard following. It's a very vocal following, very active on social media, very visible. So their numbers look larger than they are. That very active, diehard, polarizing, divisive, muscular Hindutva population of India is in the neighborhood of 10 to 15% of the population. It's no more than that. Um, they already buy the story, hook, line, and sinker. But there are enough people who see reality around them, who know, yeah, you know, Modi may be a good leader, and maybe there isn't a national alternative at this moment, but he doesn't work for me always. I'm not following him blindly. I think the genuine pluralism of Indian society, the genuine diversity of the way we live, the way we believe things, will not allow any singular totalizing vision. And this is the most appealing totalizing vision possible, right? Appeal to the supermajority, most basic identity, your religious identity. Even that does not take traction among a majority of the people. Even that does not. The only way forward is to recognize a genuine pluralism. I mean, the flip side of the argument that, you know, this will be version 2.5, it'll never be version 3, is that if the insistence on version 3 continues, there might be genuine danger down the road, genuine fissiparous tendencies, genuine breakaway tendencies, because I can imagine conditions in which the far-flung states, including the ones I just mentioned, you know, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Bengal, they're basically saying, no way, we are not dealing with this. Leave us alone. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but without a genuine recognition of pluralism, without a political acceptance of, yes, people are different, you cannot impose a vision on them, we are treading down a very, very dangerous political ground and dangerous political future.
Absolutely, and I really like. I think the reasons you pointed to for your optimism, the intrinsic pluralism. I think that's perhaps the best reason to believe that this worldview will not get imposed. Moving to my sort of last question, right? I personally benefited. I mean, I truly enjoyed reading your book and
Thank you.
learned a lot. How can we actually create? And in the start, you mentioned that only a very few very few people actually engage with full books, right? And yet the challenge is the deep need of the artist to actually get maybe 100 times more people or 1,000 times more people who read your book to engage with your ideas. They may not have read it. What's your thinking around how can we create more engagement with these ideas, with ideas of history, who we truly are? Any two or three ideas you think might work?
I don't think I have even one good idea about this. Forget about two or three. Um, I mean, we are in a pluralistic information age. There's no doubt about it, right? You got to tell simple stories. I mean, just following the principles I outlined. And you've got to tell stories that make people feel good about themselves, that they can attach to stories that they already know. How do we do that with such complexity, right? How do you do that when the attention spans are, no more than a dragonfly's? How do you actually tell people, wait, stop, think, when there is an interesting image just around the corner, just one finger flick away. There's I don't know, two rhinoceros, ramming horns, and that's so interesting. So I don't know the answer to this question. I personally am not on social media. That is because I think I may be wrong. Facebook tells you what to read, and you actually stop reading as a result. You read the same thing over and over again. That's my sense of it. And people want to be in those bubbles, information bubbles, right? They're comfortable. People are comfortable in their thought and information bubbles. People have told me, go on social media, promote, do this, do that. I'm temperamentally incapable of doing it, and B, kind of intellectually also, I'm deeply uncomfortable doing it. And the question then remains, if people like us who are kind of writing these books, thinking about them, are kind of psychologically unsuitable to be proselytizers and messiahs, what happens then? Who leads? And how do you get the word out? I don't know, Neeraj. I'm going to ask you this question. What do you think?
Yeah. So this is a question I've struggled with quite a bit, and in fact, a large part of what we're trying to do through the Belong Literature sort of collective is to focus on this. So we're trying to sort of create different formats, different time frames. So a 20-minute version, a 60-minute version, written stuff, audio stuff, video stuff, so that something or the other will work for people. And how sort of can you squeeze this kind of thinking into their routines? That's really the design direction. But yeah, a lot to still experiment with, learn. But it's quite clear that getting these ideas out to 1,000 times more people than
Absolutely
right now is super important. It's perhaps the most important thing one can do at this stage.
But the challenge, Neeraj, is pretty serious. We all have friends and family, and within them, you see how there are bhakts and there are people on our side, right? And I have an increasingly difficult time talking to bhakts. I mean, a bhakt of any kind you cannot speak to. Bhakt, today it's a Modi bhakt, but in the past and in the future, there are bhakts of other kind. They're faith-based, right? They are not rationality-based. They are not data-based. They're not information-based.
Yeah.
And if the goal is to reach out to them, the challenge is real. If the goal is to strengthen the viewpoints of people who generally lean in this curious direction, I think that's the best we can do. I don't think we can deal with the bugs. That's my personal view.
No, I agree. I think there's no point also in, so if you were to segment this whole space, right, there's no point in going after the hardest segment first. You sort of need to fight battles that you can actually win to begin with. So yeah. And I think science can come to the rescue, right? So there's a lot of research around how people form beliefs, how people shift beliefs. So how can we sort of deploy behavioral insights into these efforts? That I think. But anyway, that's a whole different discussion. Sanjoy, I've really truly enjoyed our chat right now.
Me too.
Anything else you'd like to share? Otherwise, I can maybe just finish recording right now.
No. I mean, the one thing I'll say is, thank you for reading the book carefully and asking wonderful questions. I mean, it's as a writer, there's there's a no more satisfying feeling than that.
It was genuinely enjoyed reading the book. I think it's a fantastic book that brings together so many different things, and a super important book at this stage. So thank you for writing.
Thank you.